book, The Forbidden Body, Sex, Horror, and the Religious Imagination. I'll be introducing our guests more formally in just a moment, but first I want to thank our sponsors for this event. The Mark Twain House and Museum's virtual programs are produced in part with support honoring Frank Lord, a beloved trustee of the museum who passed away a few years ago. We are happy to honor his memory with these programs, which he would have loved very much. And we're also grateful to the Wish You Well Foundation and CT Public WNPR for supporting tonight's program and all of our other virtual programs. You may, by the way, be interested in a program that we're having this Thursday, and we'll be able to put it in the chat at noontime. If you are interested in saucy and sexy programs, we will be presenting the author of Harlots, Whores, and Hackabouts, talking about a history of sex for sale. One of the benefits of this being a virtual program is that you, as the audience, can have your own conversation in the chat alongside our guest conversation. And we encourage you to use the chat feature for this purpose. We'll be posting the link to purchase a signed copy of tonight's book, The Forbidden Body, from our Mark Twain store. Getting your copy through our store not only gets you a signed copy, but it also benefits, of course, the Mark Twain House and Museum. If you have a specific question for Doug or John, please go ahead and post it in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. This will allow me, when I come back to moderate the Q&A, to find your questions. So please don't put your questions in the chat. Please put your questions in the Q&A feature. Also note that you can click on live transcript at the bottom of your screen to see live auto captioning of this event. Now that I've said all of this, I want to get down to formally introducing our amazing guest for this evening. Our author is Douglas E. Cowan. He's a professor of religious studies and social development studies at Renison University College in Ontario. He is the author of Sacred Terror, Religion, and Horror on the Silver Screen, Sacred Space, The Quest for Transcendence in Science Fiction, Film, and Television, and America's Dark Theologian, The Religious Imagination of Stephen King. Our moderator is John Moorhead. He's the creator of Theo Fantastique, a website that represents John's lifelong interest in the fantastic from his childhood in the 60s to his teen years in the 1970s and his ongoing enjoyment of the fantastic well into the 21st century. He pursued graduate studies in theological seminary, and it was there that he began to apply his interest and research in cultural studies, religion, and theology to the fantastic and popular culture. His interests in science fiction and horror also appear in Cine Fantastique Online. He's one of the editors of the Journal of Gods and Monsters and is a contributor to the anthology Butcher Knives and Body Counts, essays on the formula, frights, and fun of the slasher film. His credits go on, but I suggest that you not listen to me and that you visit theofantastique.com for more information. So please sit back, enjoy, and don't forget there will be a Q&A at the end of the program, so make sure to post your questions in the Q&A feature. Please now welcome Douglas Cowan and John Moorhead.
Doug, it's good to be with you, my friend.
John, thanks for being able to step in.
Of course. You know, you and I have been having these kinds of conversations, I think now for 20 years, something like that.
It was a bar in Louisville, Kentucky.
Yeah, I thank you for the mention and the acknowledgments for this current book. You didn't have to do that, but it's always nice to see your name in there. So I appreciate it. But, you know, before I get to a question about your academic background, I always like to find out, you bring not only your academic interest, but you bring a personal passion to this subject matter. What is it that got you hooked on horror, science fiction, and fantasy?
Well, I mean, I was always a science fiction guy, like always science fiction. I begged my parents when I was like, 7 or 8 years old to let me stay up and watch the first Star Trek, right? The first episode with the salt-sucking creature just scared the daylights out of me. So I was always really into science fiction, fantasy, a lot of fantasy during my teenage years. I was not so much into horror because I actually have quite a startle reflex. It's a little diminished now, but And when I was 15, my parents made the dubious decision to let me go see The Exorcist in one of the, and I grew up in a small town, so it's like creepy old theater. So not only you are in the creepy old theater, but you're seeing The Exorcist, which had all the hype about it, and it knocked me out. I mean, it just terrified me. So I kind of stayed away from horror until many, 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 many years later, when I started watching the Hellraiser series when I was sick. And when I got to that, you know, there's this moment. A lot of scholars can pinpoint a moment when their kind of intellectual life changes. I know that moment. I was on my couch in my house in Kansas City. I'm watching the Hellraiser films, you know, Pinhead, and I got to Hellraiser Bloodline. It's the fourth one. Yes, it's the one that takes place in space. Yes, it's the one everybody hates, but it has this great line in it. The human character is building a building that's going to become the box that brings the Cenobites in. And Doug Bradley comes on screen as just the iconic Pinhead. And the human character kind of backs up and he goes, "Oh my God." And Doug Bradley, in that great voice, says, "Do I look like someone who cares what God thinks?" And I thought, no, you don't. And I swear to you, my friend, that is the moment when my whole intellectual life kind of shifted. And I've been writing about horror and science fiction. And that was 2006. And I've been writing about horror and science fiction ever since.
Would you say that that experience with that film developed not only the intellectual and academic interest, but it kind of kindled a somewhat reluctant personal passion for horror, maybe on a par with, or at least in the same ballpark as science fiction and fantasy?
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. I because I came there with horror came this sort of passion to kind of understand the process of fear. Why are we afraid of the dark? Why do we fear the kind of things we do? And especially, why do we fear things that we cannot empirically prove exist? Like, why do we fear the demons and ghosts and things like that? So this whole project of mine has been about trying to understand that human phenomenon, but also kind of meld it with my intellectual and academic training in religious studies, because I first got thinking about it, and because I had no idea. I mean, you know, I had no idea how much religion there was in horror. But what, you know, we do as academics is we go out and we look, and lo and behold, it's everywhere, dude. And so, like, when I wrote the book on Stephen King, if you look at a lot of the earlier scholarship on Stephen King, it says, oh, the Stand is the most religious book in Stephen King's canon. Well, that's not true at all. Not even close. So it just sparked this interest. I mean, even I just finished this one. This is like the fifth book in religion and pop culture stuff, and I'm already kind of planning the next one.
I can't wait for that. I enjoyed this one as I have all the others. For those who may not be familiar with your academic work, what's your training, your background? What academic lens or lenses do you bring to this book and your whole research project?
I bring a couple of them because I know you know this, but not a lot of people know, even around the college where I work. And if they're here tonight, shout out to them. Before I was an academic, I was a United Church of Canada minister. And for those people who are watching in the States, think United Methodist. It's in the same ballpark. So I went to seminary. I went through theological training. I was a pastor for 11 years. Then I did my PhD. And so I have that kind of background. But when I approach the kind of work that I do now, I approach it as a sociologist. So rather than a psychologist who's kind of trying to find out what's going on inside the head meat, I'm really interested in the way groups perform, and especially in terms of how popular culture affects what we think about different things. Because I ask, for example, I ask my students all the time, tell me everything you know about the Greek or the Norse god Thor. And they, they never want to admit that he looks like Chris Hemsworth. But I know that that's what they're thinking about. And that's just an example of the power of popular culture to kind of inform people about these topics. And that's what I'm really, really interested in.
Well, before Chris Hemsworth was what people would go to. If you're older, a little longer in the tooth, it looked like the mechanic in Adventures in Babysitting, but that's going back. This is an elementary question, but it's one that I think is important to the conversation. I remember sitting in seminary once, and the instructor in theology said, well, how do you define religion? And people offered these theistic definitions. And I think it was, I was reading something recently by a young scholar that we both know, Joseph Laycock, and he said that, one of the little secrets of religious studies is there's no agreed upon definition of religion. So how are you defining religion for the purposes of this book?
It's a really good question, and you and Joe have hit on exactly the right point. The key is to try and make it broad enough so that it includes things that not only that look different from what we're used to seeing as religion, what we may be used to seeing, but also exclude things that people might say, well, I treat my football like a religion, or I treat my baseball like a religion. And, there are arguments about that. The actual definition I use goes right back to a guy named William James. And he said that the life of religion is the belief that there is an unseen order, and that our supreme good depends on our harmonious adjustment thereto. What he means by that is very simple. He says it's not that he says this is what the unseen order is. It's just that this is not all there is, right? Like this physical stuff is not all there is. We don't know what else there is, but this is not all there is. And we are somehow related to that. And I really like that. It's especially useful for horror, because it gets us away from what I've taken to calling the good, moral, and decent fallacy. The good, moral, and decent fallacy is the belief that religion is by definition a good thing. So if I introduce you, for example, this is my friend John, we're all going to go out to the bar later, and somebody goes, John's a really religious person. You could be forgiven for thinking that what we mean by that is that John is a good person, a moral person, a decent, and I know you to be so, but that he is so by virtue of being religious. There's simply no sociological or historical evidence for that. It's just not the way it is. So if you take that out of the equation, all of a sudden, when you start looking at a movie like Midsummer, or you start looking at any of the ones that are sort of running on Netflix right now, where you see human sacrifice, for example, you go, no, that's actually, according to James, that's real religion. It may not be religion that you understand. It may not be religion. It may not be your kind of God, but it's real religion. It is what Ernst Feil called religio, religion as if your life depended on it. Now, what I kind of add to that is something that I've taken to calling the religious imagination. And this is where being able to look at fantasy, science fiction, horror, graphic novels, because all religion, Christianity, Buddhism, Islam, Moloch worship, whatever, they all sort of emerge as part of the religious imagination. We have this religious imagination as humans, and some bits of it extrude into reality and become real religions. But that's not all there is to the religious imagination. If you look at a lot of pop culture products, you're actually seeing the religious imagination, our way of understanding or thinking about or asking questions about the unseen order, working itself out in real time. And that's absolutely fascinating. To me, that's way more interesting than writing another book about St. Paul. Like we need another one.
Right. One of the other foundational things you write about in this book that you've also written in your previous books is the relationship between horror and religion. And I know for conservative religious people, especially Christians, that idea is just anathema. I've been personally criticized in Christian circles for having an interest in horror because they don't see the two as compatible. Somehow they end up missing the horror within the pages of their own Bible. How are you making that connection, and why is it important to what you're talking about in the book?
It's a good question. There's two ways of thinking about that. Very often what happens, and this is not limited to Christians by any stretch of the imagination. I've looked at Muslims who do the same thing. I've seen Buddhists do the same thing. They will kind of make a horror product, a movie, a book series, something like that. They'll kind of make it palatable by giving it by baptizing it, as it were, by kind of making it part of their own story. So wherever you see a book or something that says like the gospel according to Harry Potter or the gospel according to Stephen King. In fact, somebody suggested the gospel according to Stephen King as a better title for my book, America's Dark Theologian. And I said, no, because that's exactly what I'm arguing against. So they'll often try to kind of baptize it and make it part of their own religious worldview. And that's one way of dealing with it. The way I deal with it is to say that horror and religion are not competitors. They are cultural siblings, if you will, because horror in a way that no other genre is, science fiction maybe, but in a way that no other genre is, religion and horror are concerned with the same questions, particularly the question, like the question that probably animated the emergence of the religious imagination, however many thousands of generations ago. And that question was, what happens to Granny when she stops moving? Right? What happens when we die? Where do we go when we die? And we start inventing all these stories about it. We start telling stories. And horror, more than anything, in all its different aspects, is intimately related to these same questions. What happens when we die? What does it mean when we suffer? Is there a way of redeeming suffering? And I think at the very bottom, is there something called a God? Does that God even care about us? Does that God think that we matter at all? Hello, H.P. Lovecraft, right? H.P. Lovecraft's work is basically religious from beginning to end. Maybe not every story, but you understand what I mean. Mm-hmm. And at the bottom of all of that is this question that is sort of central to who we are, which is, do we matter? Now, religion tends to say we matter very much. In fact, we matter so much because we are at the center of the cosmic story. I refer you to Psalm 8. He has made you just a little lower than the angels. That's a pretty, high bar, right? But you rarely see religious believers who say, well, we probably worship the wrong God, and we're kind of over here in the cheap seats of cosmic destiny. You rarely see that. It's always like we're on the front lines. And it's all about that question, do we matter? So rather than horror emerges out of religion, because although it does in some cases, I don't see them as competitors at all. I see them, as I say, these cultural siblings that are really invested in exploring exactly the same questions that has animated the religious imagination for millennia.
You've covered a lot of different subject matters over the course of this. I don't know if a series is the right way to, but numerous installments in this thought experiment. What is it that finally led you to say, I want to tackle the body in horror?
I think, I'm not even sure I know the answer to that question. Probably when I was looking around and realizing that nobody had done it yet. And all of a sudden, so if you do things in stages. So Sacred Terror was about trying to figure out, well, okay, what does horror have to say about religion? So that's a pretty elementary work. And then America's Dark Theologian is, okay, what does this one author, this one super important author, have to say about it? And then I started reading, I still remain a huge Hellraiser fan. So I've read a lot of Clive Barker, and I started thinking, less in terms of body horror, but how do we talk about religion and the body? Because the thing about the body, especially the sexualized body, is there is simply no other aspect of human nature, of human behavior, of human desire. There is simply no other aspect that religion has tried to control in more different ways than the sexualized body. So I started thinking, well, okay, how do I approach this? And it basically just went there. It's not a well thought out process, I have to tell you. I mean, I know I probably shouldn't admit this, but you know, Terry Pratchett, sadly gone now. Terry Pratchett once said that the process of writing a first draft is the process of telling yourself the story, right? And Neil Gaiman, Sandman, right? Neil Gaiman then said the process of writing your second draft is the process of making it look like you knew what you were doing all along. So the process of writing, of sort of exploring these things, is never a clean, well-organized process for me. It's always about, it's always kind of things that are scattered around, and eventually I wade through it enough that threads start to arrive. I mean, I really envy people who can just kind of start with a process and go boom, 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 and go through the process. Mine is much messier than that. In fact, there's a couple of chapters that didn't make it into the book. I had a whole chapter on Edward Lee, the splatter horror author, that had to get cut down. I mean, for example, in this book, I had to jettison an entire early chapter because I talked myself out of the idea by the time I'd finished writing it. So it's not a clean process, but it's just, there's still, every time I look, it's like, okay, I'm really surprised that scary movies still have an awful lot to teach me.
I'm going to be interested to see what kind of academic response you get to this, because as you know, horror movies are often looked down upon, even though they do great at the box office, but they're equated in some high culture with sexploitation and blood and spatter. There's really nothing redeeming there. Were you worried about that going into this subject matter? You just said, heck with it, I'm going to blaze new academic territory.
Yeah, at my stage of my career, I don't really care. But also, I didn't care at Sacred Terror either, because I mean, I remember being at a conference once, and somebody, one of the major critiques that comes up with when you do any kind of work like this, I'm sure you've encountered it as well, is people will criticize you for not doing the movie that they liked, or writing about the book that they liked. And somebody was saying, you know, why didn't you do this, and why didn't you do this, why didn't you do this? And finally I stopped and I said, it sounds like you're critiquing me for not writing the book you would have written. And they stopped and they said, yeah, I guess I am. I said, write your own goddamn book then. You know, each of these books, I intentionally, you've read the introduction, or you've read the books, so you know, I say at the very beginning of every single one of them, this is my invitation into a way of thinking about this. It is not the way of thinking about it. It's certainly not the only way. It may not even be the best way of thinking about it. Who knows? But what I want to do is invite readers into a way of thinking about this relationship that is a little deeper than simply the, well, it's just horror, it's just a movie. If it's just a movie, explain to me why nobody wanted to go swimming after Jaws came out. Right? If it's just a movie, explain to me the roll-on effect of watching a horror movie. And by roll-on effect, I mean ghost goes away, monsters destroyed, you know, whatever. I guarantee you, if something kind of moves in the shadows, you're going to jump. So these are important cultural products, right? And, you know, you and I were talking earlier about Thor, right? An awful lot of what people learn about religion is learned through popular culture. The example that I use is Scientology. You know, I ask my students, I say, you know, how many of you know a Scientologist personally? It's rare that anybody does, right? How many of you know a Scientologist personally? None. Okay. How many of you know about Scientology? They all put up their hands. So really, where did you learn it? South Park. So it's not about providing the answer to any of these questions. For me, it's about opening this up in a way that is sort of theoretically rigorous and methodologically, or at least methodologically rigorous enough that this artificial distinction between what is real academic work and what I do is kind of brought together, because the single most powerful the single most powerful force that teaches us what we know about something is popular culture, because we're surrounded with it all the time. It may reinforce what you learn in church or in school or, you know, at the family dinner table. It may not, but it's what's around. The last, you know, I'll just say one more thing, and that's like, how many conversations have you been in that began, "Hey, John, did you read that great second article in last quarter's issue of the Journal of Pastoral Theology?" And if you did, I'm sorry. But now ask yourself this question. How many conversations have you been in that began something like, "Dude, did you see last night's episode on Supernatural? Can you believe Dean goes to hell again?" Right?
Right.
It's like the air that we breathe. And that's kind of what I want to call attention to. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, definitely. In fact, this kind of leads to the next section. I'd like to dive a little bit into one chapter in your book. You talk about the significance in our conversation here, that this just isn't entertainment. This is important stuff that impacts people where they live, how they think, these kinds of things. Chapter 5 of your book is Skyclad, Sexualizing the Dangerous Other. That was my favorite chapter. You and I have both studied paganism. I've had dialogues. I've got friends in paganism. The last couple of years, I've developed relationships and dialogue with people in the Satanic Temple. It's fascinating what they're doing with religious freedom issues. But with those groups, in my research looking at the New Christian Right, it always comes down to the body as the site of tension, of the fight versus good versus evil, right? Whether the personal body or the body politic, especially for the New Christian Right. Say a little bit about how you develop these kinds of ideas about this clash in this chapter.
Well, I figured that was the chapter. As soon as you set it up, I figured that was the chapter you were going to go with. And for those who haven't read it, it begins with a sort of an extended discussion of a movie that came out a few years ago called The Witch, just subtitled A New England Folk Tale. And it's basically the story of a Puritan family who is concerned about liberalizing tendencies in their little community. So they go off and they move literally to the edge of the deep, dark forest. And in the deep, dark forest, there is a witch. Now, it turns out there's more than one. The way that movie sets up the body, you always see the Puritans kind of, and I write about it, as like armored, as it were, in their rough woolen and linen, and they're always sort of fully clothed, except when they've been in contact with the witch, which is then they become weakened. When we see the witch, the first time we see her, she's kind of, spoiler alert, she's kind of grinding up a small baby. And she looks like something out of Albrecht Dürer's engravings, you know, the four Dürer and Baldwin Grien's engravings. And gradually, one of the daughters kind of sheds her clothes at the end of the movie, sheds her clothes and walks into the forest to meet this coven of witches. And the last scene is straight out of a Goya painting. But it's as she is shedding her clothes, it's the body becomes the signifier. Because Christianity it's no secret that Christianity has treated the body with a rather pronounced sense of shame, whereas a lot of modern pagans treated exactly the opposite. It celebrates the body. So trying to look at the way this happens and the effect it has in culture was this, because again, you look at, I mean, paganism's a really good example of people who are really put at risk for their beliefs. I mean, I tell the story in the book of a woman who sort of was investigating paganism, and she went to the local library in Missouri, and there was internet filter software on the computer, and it wouldn't let her access the sites she wanted to access. So she went to the librarian, and they said, and it was actually filter software that was initially designed to filter pornography. And the librarian says, oh, no, we're not allowed to, you're not allowed to look at those sites. And if you access them, I have to report you. So, I mean, imagine yourself, right? You're a single mother, all of a sudden you're terrified about this. And yet we have this really curious relationship with the notion of the witch. Ask 100 people what witches do with little children. I guarantee you 80 of them are going to say they eat them. Right? Well, how do you know that? Because you and I know from dealing with modern pagans and relating to modern pagans, it's very different. You know, it's a religion like every other. People are not schizophrenic. They are not, you know, it has as much rationale to it as any other religion. And yet there are very few that have this real ambiguity, this real kind of ambivalence in culture. On the one hand, you've got Charmed, right? And we're not going to talk about the reboot. we're just not. But you've got Charmed, and you've got, I mean, who was after Buffy, who's the second most popular character in the Buffyverse? Hint, it's not Spike.
Angel or Faith, or which one you got in mind?
No, it's the witch.
Willow. Yeah.
Yeah. So you've got all of this. So you've got this, and then you've got, you know, the witches. I point out in the book, I don't know where it is, but I point out in the book that the witch has been used as sexualized advertising. So we have this very sexualized understanding of the witch, but it's also very ambivalent in culture. It's not clearly negative. So we have this very uncomfortable kind of relationship. And that's what I was really interested in exploring in that chapter. The other thing is that the movie, Wicker Man.
Mm-hmm.
Ask yourself, what, if you've ever seen it, ask yourself, not the other one, not the remake.
Right. The one with Christopher Lee, yes.
Yes.
Not Nick Cage.
Yeah, please. Love you, Nick, but ask yourself what makes that a horror movie. Because it's not actually a horror movie when you think about it. It's not actually a horror movie until the last 5 minutes. Prior to that, it's basically a detective story that proceeds at an almost anthropological pace. As you have the sort of the conservative Christianity of Neil Howe and the paganism of the Summer Islanders. Mm-hmm. But when you read about it, when you read scholarship about it, you find people always kind of taking the Christian perspective. Like the pagans are always, they are over there doing pagan things. And I thought to myself, well, what if you flip that? What if you flip that perspective? Because there's this great scene in The Wicker Man where Willow, her name is Willow as well, is played by Britt Eklund, is trying to seduce Neil Howe. Mm-hmm. And she's singing this song, and the camera cuts back and forth between her room and his room. And her room is brightly lit. There's almost no shadow in it. And she's dancing. She's naked. She's dancing. The light is very warm. The color temperature of the light is very warm, the white balance. And then you cut to his room. It's dark. It's wreathed in shadows. The color is desaturated. And he is just in torment over the sexuality that his religion tells him he cannot acknowledge, but it is bred so deep in our bones that, to speak with Ridley Scott for a moment, it is our species special order 937, before which all other considerations are rescinded.
Let the listener understand. That's right. We've only got a few minutes before we have to turn it over to folks with their questions, but I just want a little follow-up to that last few minutes where you have the police inspector who's burned by the pagans as a part of their intention to try and restore their crops and their fruitfulness and this kind of a thing. And I want to make a connection. Tell me if this is accurate. Is it horrific, much in the same way that the rap star Lil Nas X, his rap video where he gave a lap dance to Satan and twists his neck and looks like he steals hell from Satan himself? Here's a rap artist, African-American, homosexual, demonized during his youth by the Christian majority, turns that against his former oppressors, and it becomes horrific in their perception. In the same way that Wicker Man does, it's you get to the very end and it's the pagans who end up turning. They're the ones now doing the burning rather than the other way around.
Yeah, it's the thing that I take away from that is, and that's a whole other chapter on ritual sacrifice. Human sacrifice is religion's dirty little secret. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. And yet it's always somebody else that's doing it. But if you research, people have theorized the notion of sacrifice. One of them, whose name escapes me at the moment, said that if you push any system that is based on sacrifice to its logical conclusion, which is to say, the more valuable the sacrifice, the more valuable you have to give something up, right? You're going to arrive at human sacrifice. And this is where it's really important to pay attention to, like, what are throwaway lines. I read about King Kong and the 1931 King Kong. And one of they notice Fay Ray, and they say, oh, and they stop and they say, wow, yeah, you don't see a lot of blondes around here, because they want the golden-haired woman, right? So there's the idea of rarity, scarcity, and sacrifice, and the idea of offering up the most valuable thing you have. What's more valuable than one's own life? And this is where we need to step back out of our own religious kind of positions and try to think of that idea, Ernst Pfeil's idea of religio. And I kind of think about that as religion as if your life depended on it, because as far as you are concerned, it does. So it doesn't matter whether people are sacrificing for the crops, so the lambs will use, so the apples will bear fruit, or so. It doesn't matter. This is religion as if your life depended on it. Because as far as you understand the way the unseen order works, as far as you understand our connection to the unseen order and what is demanded of us by it, your life does depend on it. And that's right at the heart of the religious imagination. I mean, forget, spiritual but not religious. This is religion as if your life depended on it. Does that make sense? I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah. Good stuff. Well, we could go on and on, my friend, about this, but we're at the mark where I need to ask Jock to come back in and help us with questions. I've seen them coming in.
Okay.
Hello. Well, we have 2 questions so far in the Q&A. We're going to give people a chance, because you've given them so much to chew on, to throw a few
I talk a lot.
Yeah, but obviously it's such a rich subject area. I, of course, have a starter question, and that's, did you watch Midnight Mass on Netflix, and what are your thoughts on it?
I did. I did. So I have 2 things. I liked the way it was done. if it's based on the F. Paul Wilson novel from the mid 1990s, which tends to be this particular director's style, because he's also done Bly House, which is Turn of the Screw, and Hill House. On the one hand, I was disappointed because I had the storyline figured out by about the midway through the first episode. It's like, okay, you're the vampire, I get it. And yeah, but I did like the way the story kind of moved along. I found it easier to kind of stay with it. I found with Bly House and Hill House, I found myself drifting in and out because but yeah, I did like it, but I did have it figured out really early on. I'm a bit over vampires though.
Yeah.
And zombies.
I kind of felt like you got bludgeoned by the theology of it.
Yeah.
There was there was clearly such enjoyment on the writer's part of getting into the religious imagination, I guess. Maybe the best term, but
yeah, I like stuff you have to work a little harder at, I guess. But on the other hand, it's like what I was talking about pop culture. It is what people are going to sort of avert to stuff they recognize. If it's why Ju-on did not do well. You know the movie Ju-on.
No.
Okay, it's Japanese J-horror. It's one of the original J-horrors that really made it big over here. Ju-on did not do well, even among J-horror fans when it first came over to North America, because it's told episodically. There's no beginning, middle, and end narrative arc. None of the Japanese conventions are explained. It's just this horrible thing is happening. So when the filmmaker remade it for an American audience a year later, shot largely on the same set, shot with Sarah Michelle Gellar as the lead character, whereas the Japanese version is shot in a very claustrophobic way. The American version does what John will recognize that Luke does in his gospel. One of the reasons we know that Luke's gospel was probably not written for Jews is because Luke goes to great lengths to explain things that no Jew would need explained to them, right? So in the Americanized version of Ju-on, which is called The Grudge, all of these things get explained, and it did much better. So people respond to what is familiar to them. And sometimes having that theology brought to the front of the stage is what's going to get them.
That was actually one of the things that was, I think, maybe a little bit more terrifying to me, and I don't know how you felt about the film, about The Strangers, where there was no guiding principle as to why the mayhem was occurring, or they basically sum it up to, why are you doing this to me? Because you were home.
Yeah, exactly.
And that kind of chaos, without explanation, made it to me a bit scarier.
It's that ambiguity that They Follow was kind of like that as well. And it is like, we don't know where the origin of things are, like the bad things that are happening. We don't know where the origins are, but we also don't know where it's going to go at the end.
Yeah. I'm going to go to some audience questions here. And of course, I want to ask people to feel free to jump in with more. And I am going to start with one from Jonathan, who asked, do you think Hollywood should make a movie about Jesus casting out demons?
Oh, they have. I mean, I would refer you to, one of the most violent movies was the Jim Caviezel,
The Passion.
The Passion of the Christ. That's one of the most violent movies I've ever watched. Yeah. And that has demons being cast out in it. I want to say The Last Temptation of Christ has it as well, although The Last Temptation of Christ is really not about Jesus. So it's a good question for this reason. There are probably movies like that out there. They are often, though, remember I talked earlier about religious groups will layer their own theology or kind of baptize horror. There probably is a version of Christian horror which is made specifically for Christians as kind of sort of horrific comfort food for believers. You know, it's a way of reinforcing one's own set of religious beliefs. To be honest, I think what would be way more interesting is a horror movie where Jesus appears to cast out demons, fails, and all of a sudden people are going, what the hell? What now? Right? Because it's, you know, the thing with demon possession movies is if you know going in that the demon is going to get cast out, and however much spider walking and pea soup comes in the 2 hours in between, you know the way it's going to end. There's a certain horror to it, but it's not horrifying in the way that really sticks with you. Because what sticks with you is this idea of ambiguity. I am no longer certain about what's going on in the world. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think, you know, I think like Midsummer kind of nails that a bit.
Yeah, I liked parts of Midsummer a lot. For me, it was 100-minute movie that was 150 minutes long. But and I'm not going to talk about the bear, but there were, I mean, I tell you what was brilliant about Midsummer. For me, the best horror is not the jump scare, although all hail Ridley Scott for Alien, because that's a straight up masterclass.
Mhm.
But that scene where the elderly people are kind of jumping off
Yeah.
and landing, you knew exactly what was going to happen from 15 minutes out. And he kind of walks you toward that scene, and you're like, fuck, you know, and it's like, you know, and it's like you want to look but you can't look away. That to me was one of the really, really good scenes. I would love to have had more of that.
Yeah.
And less of the annoying graduate student who seemed to be there only for comic relief.
Got it. All right, we have a question from Brian. Why do you think there's popularity or resurgence of folk horror now? And what does that say about what issues our society is grappling with now versus teen slashers in the 80s, home invasions in the 90s, torture in the aughts? I'm assuming we're talking about things like Hostel or what have you. So, where do you see there's a popularity or resurgence of folk horror?
Yeah, it's a good question because we tend not to have terribly original ideas as human beings. We tend to recycle the same stories over and over and over and over.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a certain sort of segment of my world that believes that all horror can be kind of sliced up that way, no pun intended, that there is always a sociological explanation for what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
I prefer to kind of set that aside and ask if that's all that's going on. Because for me, it seems like, I talk about this in the book, it seems like you're treating the story as a riddle to be solved rather than an enigma to be explored. And, you know, once you've solved the riddle, once you've named the demon, as it were, you know, we can move on from there. The idea of folk tales, I think, is really fascinating because folk tales they've always been around, but now I think whoever the questioner is right that they're being pulled back in. Now, I mentioned The Witch. They called it a New England folk tale. I don't know if it is or not. My friend Brandon Graffius, who wrote a book on this, would know. I don't know if it's actual folk tale or not, or whether folk tale just gave it a bit of cinematic gravitas.
Yeah.
But I will tell you that the very first, if you've seen The Witch, you know that the very first time we see the witch, she's kind of flitting through the trees and she is in a red hooded cape. So these stories about lost children, about the dark, the whoever lives in the deep dark forest, about the giants that eat us. They've been around for millennia, and we just keep recycling. Why are they coming up now? I don't know that I have a good answer for that.
Yeah. What would you give as examples of it now? I mean, I think sort of Midsummer in a certain way, but like the Babadook or
Yeah, the Babadook. Anytime there's a whole series of Turkish movies called Daba, which are all based on sort of Turkish Ottoman demonic folklore. Any kind of sort of your standard demon possession movies is less based on what's going on today than it is on medieval Catholicism, because this is monster theory from 500 years ago. So you've got that, you've got the Babadook, any kind of, there's the Essex, what is it called? The Essex worm, the Essex snake, the new Claire Danes series, the Essex.
that I don't know.
And it's just popped up that I saw, and it's sort of in my list to watch. But it's about this.
Oops, someone's saying Essex serpent in
Essex serpent. There you go. Thank you, someone.
Thank you, Sarah.
It is this idea that there is this monstrous creature. Now, these kind of fables and folk tales they've been around forever, or for thousands of years. So the fact that we keep coming back to them, why we're coming back to them now, I don't really know. I mean, I don't have a good answer for that. But all I can tell you is that we will keep coming back to them.
All right, I put on my headphones because someone was saying they were asking me to increase my volume, so I hope this is better. Wanted to acknowledge Linda in the chat saying that the black t-shirt dress code is cracking her up, but I just want her to know that I am wearing a themed horror workout shirt, and John is also wearing a themed shirt. So it was not corded, and Doug is not.
And Doug is not.
Doug is just horror personified. All right. So our next question is by Karen, and I think it's kind of in. No, it's not necessarily two parts. What do you think about the popularity of witchy folk magic aesthetic, botanical prints, cottagecore, goblincore, etc.? I'm not sure if I get the question, but
I'll take a stab. I'll take a stab at it.
Okay.
I'm going to interpret the question as, what do I think of sort of the witchy aesthetic? I'm hoping that's what is being asked, or I'm hoping I'm interpreting it correctly. I think, to be honest, it's completely fascinating, because it is a way, among other things, of pushing back against the way in which, no pun intended, witches have been cast, as it were. I mean, witchcraft was illegal in Britain until 1954. You could, people weren't, but you could be tried for being a witch. And one of the very first things that modern pagans, John knows this very well, but one of the very first things that modern pagans did is start to reclaim some of the language. And with the language came the kind of the cultural accoutrement, the what we might call the witchy aesthetic. And the witchy aesthetic is interesting because it's culturally personified. The witchy aesthetic in parts of Africa is very different than the witchy aesthetic in, let us say, Louisiana. In his history of witchcraft, The Triumph of the Moon, or another was, Ron Hutton says that in a lot of places in Africa, children are warned not to go out running around naked to play, lest they be confused with being witches. So the sort of broomstick skirt, peasant blouse, with, you know, the Western witchy aesthetic, it's very culturally situated in, and it seems to me that at least it is in part a way of people trying on identity,
Hmm.
um, kind of pushing the boundaries a little bit of their own. It's becoming a modern pagan, to be perfectly honest. Becoming a modern pagan for an awful lot of people carries with it a tremendous amount of risk. I mean, to be honest, that chapter was one of the harder ones to write in this book,
Hmm.
because there are religious choices in our society, that in our Western society, that still carry a considerable amount of risk in terms of what people can im- can say about you simply by saying that you are something. It's not unlike coming out as an atheist. Coming out as an atheist can cost you your entire life in terms of family relationships, social relationships, depending on who you are, your job.
Yeah.
So, the, to me, this whole ambiguity about the witchy aesthetic, and again, I hope I'm answering the question, is fascinating, because you see like Pear's soap commercials. I mean, if you look at Pear's soap advertisements from, you know, the late 18th century, the late 1800s, early 1900s, they have the witch on a broomstick, and it's all about enchanting men. So on the
Hmm.
one hand, they're going, this is what evil witches do. But on the other hand, it's, wouldn't you like to do this too? I mean, seriously,
Yeah.
I hope
Uh,
that got it.
I would just blame Stevie Nicks for the whole thing.
I,
So um, we have a question here from Taylor, and saying, what are your thoughts on cosmic horror's relationship to religion, specifically cosmic horror's concept of a greater force at work in or around the world, sometimes in visible and terrifying ways?
that's a really good question. It's exactly what I meant when I said at the very beginning, when I asked about that question, do we matter? That's at the heart
Hmm.
of everything else. Do we matter? That's a key question that you know, the religious imagination asks. And cosmic horror, when we ask, um, do we matter? Cosmic horror says not one bit, not one bit. And that's a terrifying. I mean, the idea that we, no matter what we do, we don't matter,
Hmm.
just throws everything we think we know about how the world works out the window. Contrary to popular belief, or not popular belief, contrary to some religious belief, the universe is not made for us. The universe is not a friendly place. You don't believe me? Go to space, right? And
Hmm.
the idea, especially, and I think about people like, not so much H.P. Lovecraft, but the people who write in the Lovecraftian mode, people like Caitlin Kiernan, W.H. Pugmire, people who are taking this idea of, what if everything we think we know about the world is wrong?
Hmm. Could you give an example of this subgenre of horror, for those of us who
Yeah,
are not so deeply into the hair splitting of horror enthusiasts?
sure. Um, the what I'm talking about is a, for people who don't know, H.P. Lovecraft was a early 20th century writer who was famous for writing short stories,
Hmm.
novellas, but he died very young. He was in his early 40s. He had such a tremendous impact. His stories created, or sort of evoked, this world of cosmic entities, excuse me, of cosmic entities that are immensely powerful but have no interest in us whatsoever. And what that has spawned
Hmm.
is, um, hundreds, literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of books and short stories that explore this very same idea.
Mhm.
The idea that another way of talking about cosmic horror is cosmic indifference. You know,
Got it.
the universe is indifferent to us, because that is what brings into direct conflict with that idea of, do we matter?
Got it. Got it. All right. We have two more questions I'm going to try and get to, and then I'm going to ask one last for myself. One is, could you give analysis to the subcontextual or the subcontext of sex and religion in themes of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde? And do you think it would make a good remake?
Before you answer, Doug, I'm going to bow out, folks. I have a time commitment. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to ask the
Thanks for
question.
being here, John.
Thank you so much, John.
Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Not one, I will admit, not one I've thought about.
Mhm.
What would be more interesting to me, and I'm just going to riff on this a little bit, because I'll be honest, I haven't thought about that one very much. What I did write about in the book, though, is Dracula, specifically the very first versions of Dracula that were made in the early 30s. And you may be familiar that there was an English version and a Spanish version.
Mhm.
They were made on the same soundstage at the same time. The English company shot during the day, the Spanish company shot at night. And when you watch the two films together, and I am going to connect this to Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, when you watch the two films together, you see that they are made for very different audiences in the sense of the way the body is portrayed.
Mhm.
To use the words of the Lupita Tovar, who was the star of the Spanish version is much sexier because we are a much sexier people. That was her way of talking about it.
Yeah.
So rather than simply a version of, let us say, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, I know there have been lots of versions of it. It's just not an area I'm familiar with. I would be more interested, from the way I do things, from comparing different versions to see what that comparison shows us about the audiences for which they were made. It's kind of back to the Ju-on and the Grudge thing.
Yeah.
A lot of my work is comparative and saying, okay, what is changing this one thing tell us about the way it's being made?
Got it. And the last question, before I ask my final question, is from Tom, asking us to circle back to Midsummer. Might part of the horror of Midsummer be the normalization of abuse between the woman and her boyfriend, and how insidious emotional abuse can be?
I think if you want to see that as part of the horror of what's going on, sure. I don't think you need a horror movie to do that, though. I think that, you know, you could look at virtually any police procedural for very long. You could look at any legal procedural for very long. You could look at, you know, any number of different pop culture venues for that kind of problem in society. I don't know that you need to locate that within the context of something like Midsummer. I mean, if you again, if people want, the way I look at it is this: people bought their tickets, they get to interpret it the way they want. They get to take away from it what they want, and my job is not to tell people what to take away, but to point out other things that might. I wrote a review of Midsummer for somebody, maybe Gods and Monsters, but and I certainly pointed to that aspect of it. But what I pointed out more than anything about Midsummer is that it wasn't a horror movie.
Interesting.
It wasn't a horror movie simply because something is horrifying, or simply because we are horrified by something, does not mean it's a horror movie. I may lose 32% of your audience at this point, but whenever I look at a clip of a Donald Trump rally, I am horrified to my core. And I'm Canadian. But it's not a horror movie.
Yes.
And I would actually argue that the only thing that really makes Midsummer a horror movie is the fact that that is the way it's genreified. It's been, where do you want a horror movie? You look in the horror section. There are things that are horrifying, but there's nothing in it that you don't find deeply embedded in religious history. The idea of sacrificing oneself for one's gods, the idea of divination through extraordinary circumstances. So
I think that my last question is just, what would be a good example of something that isn't necessarily tied into Christian theology, but is, a good example of your of the work that's explored here? Like, I was trying to think of, like, what's a really good Jewish horror film, or or something's interpreted. A Dybbuk.
The Dybbuk is, yeah.
The Dybbuk is
okay. Dybbuk's a good one. What I've been watching lately is Korean horror.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, not Train to. I mean, Train to Busan is really good. I mean, it's kind of emerging as a kind of a classic, but there was a series on Netflix called The Curse, and it's sort of 8 episodes, I guess, and it's all sort of to do with Korean shamanism. Now, I'm not an East Asianist, so I don't know whether that is an accurate representation of Korean shamanism or not, but that's not the point. The point is that this is the way it is being portrayed, because one of the things that I try to avoid in my work, I don't get to tell you whose God is right and whose isn't. I don't get to tell. I'm more interested in other questions.
Got it. Would you consider Squid Game horror?
I loved Squid Game. I was watching Squid Game before it was popular. I thought, yeah, I totally would. I don't know. I'm not even sure why I could say that, but I thought I really liked it, especially the very first kill scene.
Yeah.
With the big doll.
The doll, yeah.
Yeah, with the big doll. I really did like it. I was a little disappointed in some of the B plots, but I think the idea of and I understand they're making a movie out of it.
Oh, and well, I'm sure we'll find some way to ruin it. First, I want to thank you. He's not here to be thanked, but John jumped in at the last minute. Want to thank, of course, our audience for joining us. And if you joined late or want to go back and rewatch this program, we will be posting it on our YouTube channel. So people will be able to see it in a day or so. And of course, a big reminder for people to go into the chat feature and click on a copy. Click on getting a copy of The Forbidden Body, which is available not only through our online store, but it is one of the few places outside of Canada where you'll be able to get a copy signed. So I want to thank you all. What movie should people watch tonight?
Oh, well, I'm going to go down and watch the new Halo, but I think if people actually, you know what, if people want to watch a horror movie tonight, I would go down and watch. It's an old Eric Bana movie, but it is apparently based on a true story because I just ordered the book, called Deliver Us from Evil.
Deliver Us from Evil. Excellent. All right. Well, thank you so much. It was such a pleasure meeting you. And thank you to everyone for tuning in.
And thank you for having me.
Oh,
Bye-bye.
delight. Good night.